All right, we're talking about American World War One. Before, in the last section, we actually talked about America's rise as a world power. Nothing but just another country to a world power. This section is all about us and our involvement in World War One, which we don't get to right away. The war itself is actually 1914 and 1918, and America doesn't get involved until 1917 with its troops. We don't declare war until 1917. Technically, we are quite involved. A few things that actually cause the war itself that's worth noting going over, even though this is a U.S. history class, you should still know what causes war. First, militarism. That's just another way of saying arms race. Almost imagine an arms race like you and your neighbor sitting side by side. You don't like each other. For some other reason, you have beef. One day they walk out with a pistol. You're a little scared, intimidated, so you say, hey, I need to get a pistol too. You don't get two of them just in case. So you walk out with two guns. They see you and they feel intimidated, scared, worried, and they will go buy a rifle. Right? You can see how this can accelerate over time. And in the end, nothing good comes from this. Tension builds up and usually results in violence. Now imagine if those two neighbors were two countries side by side. And you have mass number of army getting larger, navies. Everybody's trying to build a big navy at this point in history. So imagine the tension that builds up with militarism, aka arms race. Alliance is our second reason why World War One happens, and this is pretty much self-explanatory. When one country declares war on another country, the countries are going to jump in on each side. And at this point in history, many have secret alliances or alliances that literally will say, if I declare war on you, I got your back. And everybody has that. So it draws a whole bunch more into it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in a little bit. Imperialism, we actually talked about in the last section. And that's the idea of expanding territories. Everybody's grabbing new colonies. Um, Part of that, in this case, it's actually the scramble for Africa. You see a lot of European countries trying to make colonies out of countries in Africa. And doing so, Germany may take one, and then right next door, Britain is taking another one. And they end up eventually coming really close to each other's newly acquired colony territory. And it's going to create tensions. That's imperialism is a third one. Nationalism is pretty self-explanatory. Every country thought they were better than everybody else. Germany is really just forming as a country, and they wanted to prove themselves that they were a great country. I mean, when World War One is declared, people are having parades. They're excited to show the world how great their country is in Europe. The last one we're going to add, usually me and teachers just like to say MAIN is the an acronym to help you remember the causes. But we're going to add mania. A is the assassination. This is not really a cause as much as it is a spark. The first four build up over time, and it takes it puts it in context and its tension. It builds up over time. The assassination, the A for mania, this is pretty much the spark that starts it all. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is this guy right here. This is beautiful wife Sophia. Essentially, he is an archduke, royalty from Austria-Hungary. He is going to go to Serbia, which is pretty much under influence of Austria-Hungary, not directly controlled by them, but they do have a huge influence, too much for Serbia at the time. Austria-Hungary will send him down there. He will go on a parade and give a speech. In this parade route, he can go with his wife, and immediately on the parade route, he's attacked by these terrorists. See, there are the terrorist group in Serbia, and they wanted complete freedom from Austria-Hungary. They hated this idea of them having influence over them and controlling them. Essentially, what happens is a bomb is actually thrown at Archduke's car, bounces off his car, hits the car behind him, and explodes. So Archduke, his driver gets him out of there, and they get to City Hall. He's going to give a speech. Well, on its way back, the Archduke decides, hey, I want to visit the general in the hospital, the ones that bomb that bounced off his car. Well, it went underneath another car and exploded. He wants to visit the generals at the hospital, so his driver is going to try to turn around. He doesn't know the area. He turns right here in the corner. And on this little corner happens to be a deli where one of these men is actually eating one of these terrorists are actually eating his lunch. He's eating a sandwich and he sees the Archduke, their target that they missed earlier, turn the corner slowly and take another turn into alleyway. The driver didn't know where he's going. That young man is going to leave that deli, drop his sandwich, walk into an alleyway, take a pistol, and then shoot the Archduke and his wife. Archduke's last words to his wife were, "Sophie, stay alive for the children. Stay alive for the children." She passes on. His last words to those trying to help him, when they ask him how he is, he goes, "This is nothing. This is nothing." It's ironic because this is something. It's huge. What ends up happening is Austria, so upset. They're so upset that the Archduke is murdered, they send demands to Serbia. And these were like really crazy demands. Not only was like give up these guys who were responsible for this, you owe us money, land. It's very ridiculous what they're demanding. So much that Serbia didn't have a chance. There's no way they were going to do this and pay it back. But Austria said you got 30 days to do this, or we're declaring war on you, Serbia. Essentially, invade Serbia. So now you're looking at this map. You're like, okay, this is Austria for Serbia. Not two well-known countries. Shouldn't be a big deal. Remember the reasons why this war takes off and becomes the Great War. Firstly, alliance. When Austria-Hungary, when they give that ultimatum to Serbia, Russia says, whoa, 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 Austria-Hungary, that's our ally. Serbs, they're our ally. So we're going to send some troops to your border. If you attack them, we attack you. Germany says, whoa, whoa, Russia, these guys are our allies. We're going to send troops to your border. And if you attack them, we're going to attack you. France says, Germany, whoa, 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 Russia is our ally. We're going to send our troops to the border. And if you attack them, we declare war on you. Great Britain plays it cool. These guys will actually sit it out. So I'm going to put green around them because at first they actually sit it out and they say, all right, guys, this is y'all's deal. We're not going to get involved. But they tell Germany, you guys, if you invade Belgium at all, we're declaring war. Belgium's a neutral country. We're watching out for them. It's too close to us. If you invade Belgium at all, we're declaring war on you. Belgium is this tiny little country right here. I'll come back to that in a second. Italy eventually joins Germany, but Italy's, it's Italy. They're barely even a country at this point in time. And through both world wars, you can kind of laugh about Italy's contributions. It's kind of sad. Now, so you can see why alliance is a cause of the war, but what type of war was World War I? And again, this is a very highlighted just for U.S. history concept, but you've got to know trench warfare. This is a new type of war, new types of weapons. Things change dramatically. The generals in charge are old men who know very little about this new technology or how to combat it. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at this picture here, this is one side of the battlefield. Say these are the Germans, right? Say this is the Germans, their side, and these little men are the Brits. They have very similar thing on the opposite side you don't see in here. But in the middle, you have what we call no man's land. Okay, this area right here is called no man's land. Because during the war, you were foolish to even come out of your trench into that area, because if you did, you'd be mowed down by machine guns, by soldiers in the front trench, by artillery here in the back. This point in history, now they have artillery so perfect, they can bomb exactly where they're aiming at. But say the Brits do this, and they did do this before. The generals thought, okay, this is how we win this, we'll just attack this side. We're sending 100,000 men over in this specific area, and we'll break through these trenches and end this war. And essentially, that's what they try to do. So even if you did get past the barbed wire or whatnot, and you got past into first trench, and you're somehow able to overcome all the soldiers in that first trench, you still had to deal with the concrete barrier, the machine guns shooting at you nonstop from here all the way into the trench. There's a support trench behind the first trench full of German soldiers fighting. And if all went really bad, soldiers could stop in a third trench and make their last stand. So, and there are also, later on in the war, there are like small protections and some rooms. First officers could sometimes dig very deep and find rooms, but nonetheless, this was your standard setup, and why the war drug on so long. You see in airplanes up here, airplanes are often used to warn of either enemy troops before an attack or for recon. Like the Brits, before they actually did some attacking, before these Brits actually attacked, they probably sent airplanes over to see where the troops were, or who were the weakest. They probably also had their artillery bomb these guys nonstop, simply because it would weaken them before they attacked. But if you're Germany and all of a sudden you're getting bombed for 12, 24 hours, you know to get the heck out of there. And then once the bombing stopped, you knew they would attack and to come back. So again, these are old generals dealing with machine guns, fight with machine guns they never fought before, artillery they never fought before. And eventually, airplanes would go from being recon to actually shooting and bombing even at one point towards the end of the war. So new weapons, new technologies, and old generals do not mix, and it creates trench warfare. And essentially, that's what happens when you got a machine gun. First thing you do is you get down and you start digging for cover. Then you bring up your machine gun and you start shooting at them. They get down, they dig up for cover. Then you might try to flank them on right or left, and they pull another machine gun out and they pin you down. On the other side of them, they try to outflank you, but you pull your machine gun out. What that ends up doing is creating trenches all the way across Europe. On the western side, the French and German border, you'll see these huge line of trenches for both Germans and the French, and this is trench warfare. If you ever see trench warfare, it's almost always referring to World War I. There is other wars where this is trench warfare does exist, but this is a majority of all trench warfare fighting is here, and that's what happens when we have new technology and old people who don't know how to use it. So that new technology that comes out, let's talk about some of these new technologies. One, poisonous gas. Pretty self-explanatory. There's two types that they use, mustard and chlorine, and each have different effects. But the end result is pretty deadly. We'll talk more about that in a second. Tanks, towards the end of the war, these actually become a factor. At the very beginning of the war, they did very little. But somebody gets the idea and says, hey, I got to get across no man's land. I'm going to get shot and killed. How can I get across? And eventually they come up with the idea of a mobile vehicle with metal walls, and eventually turns into a tank. It progresses over time. The first ones in World War I went like 4 miles per hour. Like you could walk around the tank to the back and actually shoot the people inside if you could get out there in no man's land. So the first tanks were ineffective. At the very end of war, however, they had progressed quite rapidly and gotten much better. Airplanes actually creates a whole new battlefield in the sky for supremacy, and eventually that's going to lead to bombing. Very little, but it kind of sets up everything for World War II when you think about it, how to use airplanes for the better. And then U-boats. U-boats is just another way of saying submarine. The Germans call them underwater boats, U-boats. We call them submarines. They've been around, but now it's going to be the Germans that are going to use these submarines, which I go to more in a second. Okay. Now, countries, when this trench warfare starts, it lasts for years and years and years, and it's a stalemate, which means it's like a tie for a long time, going back and forth, back and forth. What this does is it's pretty bad for the population back home. Because if you're sending all your food to soldiers and all your supplies to soldiers and trying to get weapons to soldiers, people back home would suffer. Throughout most of history, they didn't suffer that much. At this point in time, things change. This is called total war when you take it to the civilians back home. So Great Britain was trying to starve Germany out, trying to get them to quit. So they had naval blockade surrounding Germany. Germany couldn't get supplies in, right? So essentially, you're starving your people, or you're starving the people of Germany, so that essentially the soldiers have to come home and end the war. If people don't have food, soldiers don't have food, and you got to end this war, especially if the people revolt, which happens. That's how we get to this first time total war. That's also why U-boats are actually used, which I come to in a second. Here's 3 young German soldiers from World War I. One of these is Adolf Hitler. We'll talk about in a second. All right, so the gas itself. Gas is pretty bad. They actually tried to decided to actually first did gas before they figured out how to attach artillery shells, which is pretty stupid when you think about the wind. Like, that could change easily. Mustard gas actually causes blisters. If you look at some of these photographs, see the blisters on this guy. but they could also result in some pretty bad long scarring effects, like this guy has before and after, right? Mustard gas destroying his face. Chlorine gas fills up your lungs, makes you drown. That mustard gas will get inside your eyes and cause permanent blindness. Each one of these guys are blinded by gas. And the only way you can march them back away from the front line is to tell them, hold on to the guy's shoulder in front of you, march. The guy in the very front can see. He's the one sending everybody back. Again, humans reach all new levels of destructive killing when wartime. This is the most creative Americans or people. Humanity can get pretty creative in killing other humans when they have to. Even horses which were so valuable to the war effort, you had to try to keep them alive, and so you had to try to make some makeshift gas masks for them as well. Here we have airplanes again. Like I said, played a crucial role. You may have heard that the Red Baron, the German ace, shot down a lot of his enemy airplanes. These are biplanes and triplanes. These are the first airplanes. Yes, they're made of wood, light ships. Not until much later are these actually modernized. By World War II, they're modernized. World War I, this is barely getting started. This movie, Flyboys, is it's fictional. These characters don't exist, but they do take some history and add to it. It's pretty interesting. It's crazy how this first off is just shooting from above to actually Germans actually will make a airplane where the pilot will shoot the gun here, and they have it timed where the bullets go in between the props on the propeller. And these propellers are going really, really fast. So it's actually pretty impressive they're able to do that and take it to dogfights. They call these dogfights in the air between the airplanes. This is when it actually comes and is in World War I. Have early tanks, like I said, 4 miles per hour. These systems had tracks. The first tanks they had were wheels, which got stuck in the mud. Again, that's why they had horses quite a bit in World War I. And then you have the submarine. These submarines were incredibly small compared to the ships they were sinking. The reason why this is a big deal is Britain had a huge navy. They could blockade Germany. Britain was buying supplies and bringing them in, especially from America. Tons of food, tons of weapons. America was making a lot of money during World War I, especially from Great Britain. Germany didn't have a navy to combat that, so they relied on submarines. Now, the rule of war at the time was if one ship sunk another ship, you didn't leave the people out there to drown. You picked them up as prisoners of war. But when a submarine this big, and this is actually a pretty big submarine at the time, 35 men, you can barely fit 35 men on there, really tight, cramped up. They do not have room when they sink a ship of 1,000 people to pick up anybody, do they? So these people are left to actually freeze to death in water or drown. And at that point in time, it was seen as barbaric. I know it's weird to say there's a code when it comes to war, but that was like a general rule. Like you sink another ship, you pick up the people who are drowning. You don't just leave them to die. And that's what the Germans had done. And so that actually made them look like the most evil people ever, which we come back to that in a little bit. The German picture shows 3 soldiers. This guy is Hitler. The reason why he has a full-length mustache World War I was because everybody did. It was actually pretty fancy. It was a cool thing to have. Like guys with beards now, you have a big mustache like the leader, the Kaiser of Germany, which is like the king. He had a big mustache too. But when gas comes out and Germany makes a gas mask, you have to create a seal around the face so gas can't get in there. And that seal actually went all the way just like this, around and around here. So if you put a seal to your face and you have all this hair like here and here, it doesn't create a seal at all. Like air is going to leak in there. Hair doesn't seal very well. So German soldiers have to shave their mustache, or in Hitler's case, shave part of it, right? Just a tad bit the ends of it, so the gas mask would work. Now, after the war, Hitler keeps this little look he has because it reminded people that he fought in the First War, and he was a war hero. He's a veteran. So if you're ever wondering where that funny mustache came from, that's why. It became almost a fashion, if you will. But it reminded people that he was a veteran in World War I. When you saw that, you knew that he had fought in World War I. And Hitler was a messenger in World War I. Pretty dangerous job. He's hit with gas twice. The second time he's actually recovering in hospital from the second time when the war ends. That's how he actually finds out in the hospital bed. Now, we can go into depth for quite a while about Hitler and World War One, but this is U.S. history, so we're going to go back to U.S. involvement in this war. And at first, there is none. Wilson practiced neutrality, which means stay neutral, keep out of it. As a matter of fact, he won his first election in 1912. Remember, we had talked about how he beat Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. 1916, he reruns. His re-election is based on keeping them out of war, keeping the U.S. out of war, and so Americans, for the most part, agree with this idea. Okay, but the U.S. will eventually enter the war and pick a side. Why did they mention into War One? Closer ties with the Allies. Think about it. Great Britain speaks English. We speak English. We have a similar background. We're also going to give billions to Great Britain, some money to Germany, but you might know this: the winner pays you back, the loser doesn't. So who do you want to win? The guys you gave billions to, or the guys you gave a little bit to? So we're already picking sides, even though we're staying neutral. Deep down, we are. German actions with the U-boats going to really put us against Germany. And then our Allied propaganda that shows savagery of Germans. British propaganda, French propaganda, it showed how bad Germans were and what was going on. It actually does play a huge role in America choosing a side. Even though at this point in history, the number one foreign immigrant and foreign people, or people in the United States that were foreign born, were actually Germans. Many people were scared of that. They were revolting. The last thing that really makes us pick a side is the Zimmerman telegram. A few months before he joined the war, this is a big one. This is actually a telegram right here, just a bunch of numbers. But essentially, what this was the German ambassador sent this to Mexico that told Mexico's government that if you make war against the U.S., Mexico makes war against the U.S., after the war in Europe is over, Germany will help Mexico get back Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas from the United States. That was a deal that they had struck. They were trying to get with Mexico. It was intercepted and published, and again, Americans hate Germans even more. Like, clearly, they're trying to conspire and get other countries to attack us. So you can see why eventually, even though we were trying to stay neutral from the very onset, that's very debatable if we actually were staying neutral. All right, so freedom of the seas is this idea that you can travel the seas without worrying about being attacked, tariffs, or anything like that. This plays a big role during the war itself. I already talked about how British would blockade, the Navy would blockade Germany, keep goods. Germany responded by having U-boats sink any ship coming to Great Britain, including cruise ships. The most famous one was the Lusitania, had roughly 1,000 people on a cruise ship, was sunk by a German U-boat, and 120 Americans died on board on the way to Great Britain. To be fair, Germany actually took an ad out in the local paper in Philadelphia where this cruise ship left and said, "Do not get on this. It's going to war waters, international waters where a war is taking place. We will shoot and destroy it." And they did that, and it caused a huge uproar. Germany actually did it again, but not to Americans. And actually, the next time they do it is actually in Europe, but it forces Germany to make this two-sex pledge in 1916 that said they would not sink any more ocean liners without a fair warning. So you can surrender to them, but fair warning, we're going to shoot you. They have to notify you. They're just not going to torpedo you and run off. That was 1916, but by 1917, things are so desperate and so bad for Germany. They announced that they're resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, which means there's no restrictions. We're bombing whatever we see in international waters that's not German. Cruise ships, whatever. And to be fair, on ships like the Lusitania, years later, they'll bring that ship up and discover that the U.S. government was actually smuggling weapons to Great Britain on an entire deck. The other decks were people on the cruise. So the U.S. government was actually using people, human shields, to get their weapons over to Great Britain. Again, we're making money off them. So, undersea submarine warfare starts again in March 1917. The Germans would shoot like 5 U.S. ships, and eventually that's enough. By April, Wilson asks for a declaration of war on Germany, and Congress accepts. Okay, so this event timeline, 1917, shows you how things progress. January, that Zimmerman telegram is intercepted by the British. They can put it out there for the Americans to see. It goes public. In March, right here in the middle, in March, Germans start sinking whatever ships they see, including 5 U.S. ships. As a result, in April, U.S. would declare war on Germany. It's bound to happen eventually. By June, we've got troops in France ready to fight Germans. And at the end of that year, in November, Russia actually leads the war. Russia has a communist revolution. They're going to kill their king and royal family, and these communists take over, and they decide they're not fighting in this war. This is a capitalist, rich monarchy, king and queen's war. They don't want to be involved in it, so they leave in November. But thankfully, Americans are already on France. So by the time Germans move the troops from Russia front line over to France's front line, luckily French and the British have us American troops to lighten the load, if you will, to help them out after they've been fighting for 3 years. We come in pretty fresh and ready to go. Those leading the American troops is a man named John Pershing. You have to know that. American troops were called the American Expeditionary Force, also known as AEF. Instead of saying Marines or Army or anything like that, that was their name. But you got to know Pershing led them into battle. Luckily for you, STAAR test only asks one battle, and that's the Battle of Oregon Forest. It's known as a significant battle because it's going to break German lines, and Americans are involved in this battle. Break German lines, capture a railroad station where supplies are going to the Germans, and it's often been credited as leading up to the truce. That's actually why the truce is going to be declared for the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, which is November 11th at 11 a.m. And they did that because they want to give people time. This is actually a couple of days before this, but they want to make sure everybody know that this is a time. November 11th at 11 a.m. would be a truce, where they agree to quit fighting until they have a treaty done. And it's often said that the Battle of Oregon Forest led to this because the Germans were weakened without their supply line anymore. This is why we actually have Veterans Day on November 11th. It's because of this date. One of the veterans from that war that you have to know is Alvin York. He's going to be given the Medal of Honor, which is the highest medal you can actually receive. Very difficult to get in the Army or Marines or any armed forces. You have to have multiple eyewitnesses. You have to go above and beyond. He did that. He killed 25 Germans, captured 132 after destroying machine gun nest and capturing another machine gun nest and pointing at a German machine gun nest and pointing at other Germans while his whole platoon died. So Alvin York is a Medal of Honor and a hero from World War I, you have to know, nonetheless. Whenever we say the home front, we mean what's going on at home during the war. The battlefront is where the battle takes place. The front line is the very, very actual battle itself. Home front is everything going on at home. World War I isn't as big home front as World War II. Very similar, but not on such a large scale. We will have the Selective Service Act in 1917, where guys, once you're 18, you have to register selective service and you can be drafted. And so men are drafted at the time. 2 million men go to Europe, which means back home, African Americans, minorities, and women are going to fill jobs at home. Not in the same large scale we'll see in World War II, which we talk more about that, because it involved a lot more troops in World War II. But at this point in time, we will see migration of African Americans across the United States in northern areas. How is war paid for in America? Well, war bond, higher taxes, but mainly war bonds, which meant you bought a piece of paper from the government, and that piece of paper was a certificate that said war bond. Will return to you at 10% above value after the war. If I spent $100 on this war bond and waited after the war, I could cash it in and get $110. Pretty nice. But those were the way war bonds worked, and that's how America would actually fund its war itself. Now, there were some rights, some ideas that were being questioned at the time, and this plays in a role even in modern times. The Espionage Act is passed. Make sure you know that. This made it a crime to criticize the war effort at all. So you could speak bad about the war, about the president, about the army. You couldn't publish papers bad about it, anything. You could not criticize the war effort. And you're thinking, well, that violates my rights. Matter of fact, that violates my First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press. And you know, if it violates your rights, eventually somebody gets arrested for it and they take it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides if laws like this one violates your constitutional rights. That's the job of the Supreme Court. That happens in Schneck versus U.S. Schneck is actually passing out anti-war pamphlets on the corner in New York, telling men to resist the draft. Bring your draft cards is what they do to resist the draft. Don't go. Schneck is arrested, tried under the Espionage Act, makes the argument, hey, that's a violation of my rights. You can't have that law. And so it goes up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court make a famous ruling that says a First Amendment did not protect words that create a clear and present danger. The example they use, Supreme Court says, you cannot be in a crowded movie theater, yell fire. Everybody tramples out, kills people in the process, people die, and then you later say, just kidding, but you can't get mad at me, it's freedom of speech. Like, you can't say that. You presented clear and present danger. So that unfolds even in modern times when our former president said, encourage a crowd to attack the Capitol. People have argued, hey, he can do that, freedom of speech. People have argued, you can't take him off Twitter, Facebook, or social media. That's violating his freedom of speech. Well, if it's a clear and present danger, that's actually illegal, and you go to prison for that. Depends on who views it. But nonetheless, modern times, that's actually different because in modern times, those are private companies. And as long as you're not discriminating against a person based on race, gender, or religion, it's not discrimination, it's a private company. They can do that. You agree to the terms and services when you sign up. But this actually goes even, we'll talk about this more actually when we come into play with the Vietnam War and how students themselves, what rights they have and don't have when it comes to criticism in the schoolhouse. Well, eventually we will have a treaty, and that treaty takes a while to discuss. We have the truce and we have a treaty. Wilson, our president, will fly out to Europe to negotiate this treaty, but he's kind of laughed at. Remember, the war goes on in 1914, 1915, all in 1916. Americans don't get there to halfway through 1917, and it finally ends in 1918. So if you're a European power, you've been here, half of this for so long, and then these Americans come in and barely do anything at all, barely lose any man, barely have to sacrifice compared to you. You don't care what the president suggests. As a matter of fact, he had these 14 points, and they're all important. And it makes sense, right? Freedom of seas, no blockades, right? No submarines. He says, end secret diplomacy with alliances. Stop producing arms race, stop trade barriers, fix your colonial claims, as in stop claiming colonies, divide up Austria-Hungary. They're just too big, too powerful, too strong, and there's two different types of people. He even suggested creating a country between Germany and Russia called Poland for Polish people. Some of these are met, but for the most part, he's ignored. However, this is a big one you should know. He has his dream of creating a League of Nations. Imagine a room where one person from each nation in the world can meet. And if there's ever an issue, they all can agree on what to do. So say China is going out of control, invading other countries, the whole world meets the League of Nations, and they all decide they're going to boycott China, attack China, whatever they decide. It can prevent another world war if they're all in agreement on what to do. He has this idea, this belief, a League of Nations. That will definitely make it into Versailles, amongst a few other things. Treaty of Versailles is a treaty that ends a war that the European powers actually create and sign. In it, here's the main points. Germany loses a lot of territories. Take a look at the maps before and after. Austria-Hungary is divided up so that they don't become an issue anymore. Poland's actually created too. I don't have that listed on here, but you can see a country separating Germany and Russia so they quit fighting each other all the time. It's actually created. God dang. There is the war guilt clause. Germany agrees to admit full blame of war, and they have to do this at this point in time because they're so poor off that the French actually do this, sign this, or we go to war. In reality, this literally went down. The guys from Germany came to negotiate. they put them in a separate house and then gave them the treaty and said, sign it or we continue the war. So Germany is really forced to do this. Germany is forced to pay reparations, to pay back all this money from the war that it cost the Allies for war damages and just the war itself. The League of Nations is created, but the two biggest countries, the U.S. and Russia, failed to join. Russia's not invited. They're still a rebellious little country having communist revolutions. The U.S. refuses to join, and we get to that in just a second. So the League of Nations becomes like this, it's empty shell. It's pretty much worthless because the two largest countries aren't part of it. So the influence of the League of Nations, it becomes a joke. And the Treaty of Versailles that ends World War I actually will set up everything for World War II because it puts in power. And there you have the League of Nations bridge. All these countries are part of it. But the most important brick that holds the whole thing up in the middle, the keystone, is the U.S. And we're the gap in the bridge. Political cartoons arise like this because back home, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge is going to lead the fight not to ratify that treaty. If we ratify the treaty and become League of Nations, we lose power. What if we want to go to war with another country? What if we don't like what China's doing? We want to go to war with them, but everybody else says no. We don't want to give up power, and that's one big thing that Americans fully believe, that we should decide everything. And when you think about it, if you see NATO or the United Nations, we're part of that in modern times, right? But we don't send our troops to be controlled by them. We don't ever do that. Other countries do that, but we don't do that. Americans do not like losing power and decision making. So Henry Lodge leads the Senate to fight to not to ratify the treaty, and actually we won't ratify it. Wilson actually tries. He actually goes on a tour of all of America to get these things ratified, ends up causing a stroke for him. But nonetheless, Lodge is successful. America will sign a separate treaty with Germany, not actually including the treaty of, not including the League of Nations. So the Treaty of Versailles ends World War I for Europe, but technically the U.S. actually signs a separate treaty. What happens to America after this is, in the end, Americans look at this war and we've lost over 100,000 men, thousands of men in total, 100,000 men. 100,000 men in one battle, right? So it's pretty bad. Americans will look at this and begin this policy of isolationism. After World War I, we realized this was a waste. What did this prove? This didn't change anything. Things are worse in Europe now. We should never went over there in the first place. And America would shrink back after this for next, almost 20 years. We're going to go back to ourselves and not care about the rest of the world. And that's going to give people like Hitler a chance to take over. Now, that is a very quick and short version of America's involvement in World War I, leaving a lot of cool, interesting stuff, but it's enough for your state test and in this class.